Hi guys, my name is Sydney Showers and I'm going to be going over my PowerPoint presentation for English 102 in Miss Shauna Hayes' class. So here is the beginning of my PowerPoint, and we have the name of the poet for the poem that I chose for this essay, Rasaq Malik Gbolahan. That is the name of the poet that I chose for the essay background. And for the author background, we have in the next slide is the poet's name, and right here is his birth date. He was born in 1992. He was born in Oyo State, Nigeria, which is Sayin. He graduated from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, where he received his bachelor's and his master's degree, actually his behaviors. And he received those in 2013 and 2017. I put that he is a Nigerian poet and essayist. And this is the name of the poem that I chose. It's called As a Child I Knew Nothing About Grief. So I put the title there on that slide. And moving on to the next slide, we have how does the poem relate to society when it was written? So for this one I put, children like adults experience a range of emotional and behavioral reactions immediately after death, providing a shared language and space to explore that they are not alone in their grief, potentially sparking conversations humans can have even with tragedy. Moving on to the next slide, we have the next question, and it is, how does the poem relate to society now? So for this question I put, a child may see himself as helpless and vulnerable after such loss. Shielding children from confronting death and grief has been a norm for our society today. And for now in our society, it encourages others to discuss and let out their feelings when dealing with loss or grief, and also gathering an audience opinion while promoting engagement and making sure the audience feels involved. So I said that is how the poem related to society now. And moving on to the next slide. Which is take a read with me. So then on here you can click the video, and the video will have me read the poem to you. And moving on to the next slide. The poem paraphrased and detailed annotation. I responded with, the meaning of the poem is to project one's feelings and emotions when processing grief. I also said, expressing that the societal norm could lead to children when they encounter loss later in life. Children lack the understanding to navigate their emotions. And I put several quotes from the poem itself to kind of back up what I said. Until the clock of my grandmother's body stopped working and her remains were lowered into the earth on that Friday morning, when the air was heavy with the silence, lines 1 through 4. Another quote that says, the lesson is to be taught in the passage from the poem is to allow yourself to feel your grief when it is tolerable to do so. People will often find relief allowing themselves to feel the impact of their grief. And in the next slide, it is asking for the poem's pattern. And so for the poem's pattern, I put the poem is free. There is no pattern. The pattern has no effect on the poem. And then I put several quotes as well to back up this theory. Until the clock of my grandmother's body stopped working and her remains, lines 1 through 2, were lowered into the earth that Friday morning when the air was heavy with the silence, lines 2 through 4. Of the bereaved who gathered at her funeral, each one of them performing grief, lines 3 through 4. And we are moving on to the next slide. This question was to identify at least 3 themes. And in this slide I put for number 1, the exploration of the innocence of childhood. Number 2, contrasting the harsh reality of loss and grief that comes with growing up and experiencing death. And number 3, highlighting the naivety of youth and the inevitable confrontation with morality. I put a quote from the poem that says, "How heavy the luggage of grief, Lord," and that is from line 31. And moving on to the next slide, we have the question asked to provide at least 5 poetic devices used in the poem. I put metaphor, personification, imagery, elegy, and irony. I put metaphor because the quote is used for this to back it up is, "Until the clock of my grandmother's body stopped working and her remains were lowered into the ground that Friday morning," which is lines 1 through 2. Personification for the quote, "Of the world that led us to count our days and prepare us for the boat of death that will arrive someday to ferry us to the afterlife," lines 9 through 10. Imagery for the quote that says, "Right after her burial, I listened for her breath. In the quietude of the room, not even the cups on the tray made any noise." This gives imagery that the cups did make noise when his grandmother was alive, lines 14 through 15. I put elegy for the quote in the poem that says, "Here on earth there is nothing that will save us from the pang of death that will clench," and that's lines 34 through 35. Irony for the quote in the poem that says, "When the air was heavy with the silence," this is giving irony that the air was heavy with silence, giving the reader an idea of how the air could have been affected by the loss of his grandmother in line 4. A metaphor is comparing childhood innocence to a lack of knowledge about grief. The personification example is, while less prominent, one could argue that grief is slightly personified that a child could know or be unaware of. Imagery, I use this because it uses a descriptive word or phrase to create a vivid picture in the reader's mind. I use elegy because it gives the reader an expression of a deep personal lament and reflection on the speaker's past innocence. And irony I used for this poem because using words or expression in a way that's opposite to its usual meaning, and for irony that was when the air was heavy with the silence in line 4. Moving on to the next slide. The question was to identify the word or tone of the poem. And for this I said the mood is determined by the underlying poetic devices used in the poem. Strengthening your familiarity, refining a delivery style, pacing, tone, and emphasis was used in the poem to distribute the mood or the tone. Aims for seamless professional delivery. I put the quotes from the poem to back up this theory. When the air was heavy with the silence, which is line 4, Of the bereaved who gathered at her funeral, each one of them performing grief, lines 5 through 6. Here on this earth there is nothing that will save us, that will clench, lines 35 through 36. That is identifying the mood or the tone in this poem. Moving on to the next slide. This is asking to describe the narrator. Rasaq Malik Gbolahan is a Nigerian man, and he is a poet and essayist. In this poem, he is speaking from the past, and his grief is taking over in his writing. Rasaq is speaking from his overall experiences with the death of his beloved grandmother. And I also put quotes from the poem to describe the narrator and his writing for this poem. Until the clock of my grandmother's body stopped working and her remains were lowered into the earth on that Friday morning, lines 1 through 4. When the air was heavy with the silence, line 5. He uses very good descriptive words in his poems, I feel. And then the next quote is, of the bereaved who gathered at her funeral, each one of them performing grief. This is lines 6 through 7. Moving on to the next slide. Personal reflection poem. This is my own personal view on why I chose the poem and how it relates to my life and my favorite lines, so we're going to dig right in. For the reason I chose this poem, it is because it discusses grief and gives great insight as to how it might feel to have to bury a loved one. I lost my dad to pancreatic cancer in 2021, and I have lost people close to me, but never a parent or an elderly figure in my life or role model of the sorts. It was the worst pain that I've had to endure in my life. Rasaq lost his grandmother when he was very young, but the pain he feels after losing her is almost the same pain I felt when I lost my dad. It relates to my life because grief is something that everyone will soon have to encounter, but expressing that grief is easier said than done, and this poem brings great motivation to me, and not only me, but probably to others as well, to not stop expressing yourself about the loss of a family member. And my favorite line is, how heavy the luggage of grief, Lord, is line 21. And I chose this line specifically that stuck out to me the most from the whole poem because losing my dad brought me closer to Christ, so this caught my eye because he mentions the Lord. And moving on to the next slide. My questions for the class is, I put a couple here, so I'm going to start from one. Can you relate to the loss of the narrator that he expresses in his poem? If so, how? Explain your feelings of grief and loss in your own ways. What was the overall message from the poem that you got from it? And what did you take from it? Number 3, how did this poem make you feel? We went over what the mood or the tone was for the poet, so I kind of wanted to dig in on how did it make others feel for their mood and tone for the poem, or what they interpreted. For number 4, I said, what was your favorite line from the poem? I would really like to know what your favorite line was and what line stuck out to you the most out of the entire poem. Number 5, how did the narrator's grandmother pass? If you read the poem, you will know how his grandmother passed away, and I feel like that's pretty important to know. And I asked, can you find it in the poem? Number 6, how can this poem be used in the future to expand the writing process for other poets? What do you think? And here's my last slide where I say thank you, and it is my class information in the bottom left corner. Miss Shauna Hayes, English 102, done and completed on February 21st, 2025. and I hope that you guys enjoy the poem as much as I did and somehow can relate to it as much as I did, and enjoyed my PowerPoint presentation, as I love flowers, and I just thought it was a really good layout for this poem and presentation. And that is pretty much the end of my PowerPoint presentation on the poem by Rasaq Malik Gbolahan. As a child,